very well and also know that everything will be inevitable, thus, it will, in fact, arrive. So why do you ask? Billy says I just wanted a confirmation, nothing more. Semyaza says you have thus received it. Can I now go on? Billy says of course, that was, for the time being, my last question, until the next one. Actually, this already fits, but I'd gladly still wait with it if you have more important things. Semyaza says just ask, for otherwise, you'll give it no rest. Billy says once again, you are probably right about that. Well then, my question is this: your official details about the number of Jupiter's moons aren't right because they only correspond to a part of the truth. To my knowledge, this giant planet has 17 larger moons and several smaller ones, as I learned from Patar during the Great Journey. Semyaza says that's right, but for certain reasons, that may not become known on the Earth before the month of September, 1979, after that, this fact will then no longer play a role. By the way, at least 2 other moons of the planet will be discovered by the American scientists in the course of their evaluations of Jupiter's images. Billy says then it won't be only 1. Semyaza says I told you that they will discover at least 2, after which then only 3 of the larger ones and several of the smaller ones still won't be known to them. Billy says that is, indeed, something, but I'll be silent about that. Semyaza says that is also of urgent importance, but on the other hand, you are able to be silent, without it causing you difficulties. For this reason, I will also entrust to you, likewise under the obligation to maintain secrecy, that a lot will be decided for you and all group members in the next year. As usual, these decisions will be connected with serious lies, destruction attempts, and intrigues, which will primarily go out due to the brothers H and K and their aunt OW as well as MFU, and else I should even be taken before a court. But you shouldn't be disturbed by this because through these intrigues, lies, and destruction attempts, you all will be able to register the first great success in reference to the publicizing of your and our mission. Thus, it will be that Japanese television will make a good film in your center about our interests, after which then soon, in the month of September or October, 1979, also the first book will be completed and sold. Billy says human child, that is some piece of news. But why, exactly, will Japanese television come? Semyaza says this will be the merits of your American friends. The first book will also be given in print by them, and this work will be one that cannot find its equal on Earth. Billy says is it the one that Wendell Stevens has written? Semyaza says no, it concerns another one, filled with your best shots of our beam ships. Billy says there, I am but curious. But why, then, must I be silent about that? Semyaza says because through this, many of those of your enemies can still create big lies and intrigues and spread these worldwide, which will then be recognized as such by the film and the book, by what means the spreaders of lies and intrigues will suffer a tremendous defeat and become non-credible all over the world, which is necessary. Billy says regular psychological warfare. Semyaza says that's right, it really represents such. Billy says then I can, indeed, look forward to everything quite calmly. Semyaza says certainly, you can do that, for there is no need to worry about it. Billy says okay, then one may be content. Do you still have other things in stock? Semyaza says sure, even very important things, which will also bring you work. Billy says in what way? Semyaza says it concerns coming events upon whose occurrence you are to compose a brief writing, in order then to hand this over to various governments of the earth. Billy says you know, nevertheless, that I've already done that several times, but no reaction had ever come from it. Semyaza says sure, but you should still strive for these things at the given point in time. Billy says I can do that, of course, but what does it deal with, and what should become of it, if no success arrives again? Semyaza says I will explain the connections to you in a moment. If no reaction should occur upon your efforts, then the work was, unfortunately, in vain. But at the same time, your and our obligation will have been fulfilled to try a change to the positive for a threatening and serious political turmoil, which can lead to nasty, destructive riots and wars and those things that were already transmitted to you as prophecies in the year 1976. Billy says you give me a riddle, for I don't know what you're talking about. Semyaza says think of the prophecy of the threatening Third World War. Billy says, now the penny has dropped. You speak of the prophecies, in which there is talk of the overthrow of the murderer Emperor Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, of whom you have, indeed, already spoken, and of the death of the Yugoslavian dictator Tito, who shall pass away in the next 3 years, when Saturn shines its light on the earth, and of the invasion of the Soviet-Russian army into Afghanistan at the end of the year 1979, as well as of the re-election of Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister in India and her then following death, which will shake the entire Indian nation, as well as of the alliance of the Americans with various Middle East and Far East countries, to which still the alliance of the Pakistanis with the Chinese comes, along with many other events to be expected. Semyaza says sure, I speak of that, but no prophecies were transmitted to you in such detail because those details weren't mentioned in them. Those come from your own calculations. At any rate, you haven't received them from us. Billy says I'm sorry, I have, in fact, somewhat calculated the events to be expected. Semyaza says my words shouldn't be a reprimand for you. Billy says then I've misunderstood you. Semyaza says you surely haven't made it public, but only talked about it in your group. Billy says that's right. Semyaza says then everything is, indeed, good. Have you calculated any other details? Billy says I have, namely some political machinations, which must lead to the fact that the ways are actually paved for the fulfillment of the prophecies. Semyaza says what possibilities have you calculated? Billy says for example, I have discovered, as I already said, that the Pakistanis, and to be sure, the West Pakistanis, will make a military and politico-economic alliance with the Chinese, so these can find unhindered inlet into Pakistan. This must lead then, according to Adam Rees, to the fact that the Chinese will then possibly settle in Pakistan and open the way and appropriate up to the western part of the Indian Ocean, by what means the exit and access road from and to Arabia is then already opened for them, should they want to advance one day, if the prophecy should fulfill itself, into the Middle East in order to fulfill the prophecy there. In addition, my calculations yielded that the Americans could get involved with the Pakistanis and the Chinese because they have to fear an advance of the Russians from Afghanistan to the Indian Ocean, through which the whole situation becomes even more muddled and through which the Russians are forced to further steps which could produce rather bad consequences, and this would be the beginning for the fact that the bear then breaks out, as this is written in the prophecy. Moreover, it also arose from my calculations that the scorpion, even Indira Gandhi, in her nature of instability and intrigue strength, can suddenly take a catastrophe-wielding political step in the direction of Russia, which could mean a renewed threat to overall world peace, for then the Russians would also gain a foothold there, namely in India, and thus would again have a free way to the Indian Ocean, like if they would penetrate through Persia or Pakistan, whose rulers are so childish and inadequate and ignorant that the possibility must also be given to them that they will pave and open the ways for the Russian army. All the calculations show that the situation could become so very muddled that the right action resulting from it can only be recognized with difficulty. To this still comes the confusions of various non-aligned and other countries up to Europe, as well as the instability and lack of directionality of the leaders of these countries, who are worse than teenage children in their decision-making power and illogic. So also from there, further malicious political threats, intrigues and unconscious destructive factors are still lurking, which could contribute their part to the beginning of the downfall, even though at the time of the first world-shaking crisis, after the invasion of the Soviet army into Afghanistan, some super-clever, special politicians, etc. will claim that a third world war cannot threaten anymore. However, these super-clever ones and know-it-tales don't bear in mind that the Third World War won't break out all of a sudden as such, but that, as the beginning already proves and as it will soon prove itself again after the invasion of the Russian army into Afghanistan, several individual countries will first get together in the wool and allow acts of war to break out from this, before the larger unions of various countries are found, which could then lead to the World War. The UN and NATO will then no longer have anything at all to report about this. And to be sure, already then when the Russians march into Afghanistan, which, incidentally, they have to do at the end of 1979, for they are obligated to do so by a contract, Therefore, they will properly march in there and not make an incident of war, as it will be maintained. The UN and NATO, however, will become jumping jack organizations after this incident because they have never been so developed in their sphere of influence as this would have had to be the case. Those responsible of these two organizations, and those involved in them in other ways, were and are, in truth, never capable of developing these organizations into what they basically should have become. Thus, they won't be able to receive enough power and respect for themselves at the given point in time to change or even just to authoritatively influence the threatening world political situation in order to attain a change to the positive. But at the same time, these leaders aren't capable of this, so even they, with their two organizations, can't change anything in the impending fulfillment of the prophecies if, within a period of 1 year, the beginning of the one-day possible bitter end in the third millennium begins to develop itself. Semyaza says you have dealt with these matters very thoroughly, so not just a little. Yes, your remarks, unfortunately, correspond to the bitter truth, but some things could still be changed for the better in everything if you would compose an explanatory writing and submit it to the governments, and if your remarks would then be dealt with, which isn't clear, unfortunately. But still, you should write these remarks and declarations at the appropriate time, and to be sure, in the month of February, 1980, and submit these to the state governments of the earth. Billy says if that is your wish, then I'll do it, of course, but to tell the truth, I expect nothing of it, for one won't listen to a single human being, especially when he is labeled as a spinner and visionary, as this is the case with me. Semyaza says nevertheless, you should do it. Billy says okay, your wish shall also be mine. Then should I also mention details and exact data with this, like, for example, the date of death of Tito and that of Indira, as well as the sad and murderous misery that will break out in Persia after the taking over of power of the insane Ayatollah Khomeini? And should I also mention the inglorious end of this one and of the murderous Shah, which approaches the two? Semyaza says no, you may not make any public announcements about that, as this would lead to confusions and catastrophes, for which you could never take responsibility. Billy says then those events are also taboo, which will happen in Germany, Switzerland, and in America, and which will also range outside of politics. Semyaza says you must also be officially silent about those, also about what will occur in the South American countries, in Africa, and in various European countries in bloody events of a political and criminal form. You should also make no more predictions, as I've already advised you. Billy says by that, do you mean only the politically criminal ones, which will exhibit unusual degeneracies in the future, or the criminally criminal ones, which will fall into similar malicious courses like the political ones? Semyaza says it applies to everything. Billy says and what about the fanatical murders, suicides, and massacres from the religious sectarians and terrorists, who will start regular slaughters? And what about, for example, the Queen of Holland, who should resign, according to my calculations, in the spring of 1980? Do I also have to be silent about that? Semyaza says if it concerns such harmless things, like the resignation of this queen, then the disclosure of your knowledge plays no major role, for this queen isn't in a world political situation that could provoke the important changes through an early disclosure of the fact that she wants to leave her office. In addition, until now, I knew nothing about the fact that this queen wants to rid herself of her office. Do your calculations relating to this agree? Billy says I think so. Haven't you dealt with these things, then? Semyaza says no, because so far, there was no reason to do so, for the country of this queen is, for the time being, of no major importance because the foreign policy of this country has a correspondingly flat shape. Billy says oh, I see. But what about the terrorist and sectarian happenings, etc.? Semyaza says also about those, I must obligate you to be silent publicly. Billy says okay, then just so be it. It gives me no joy anyway to bring these things to the man. On the other hand, it is also pointless because the human beings also wouldn't change through this. And thirdly, I would only be insulted even more as being crazy and a visionary. Semyaza says sure, by this, you can save yourself that. Have you even calculated other coming events? Billy says no, I haven't dealt with any more. Semyaza says then I would still like to tell you other things, which will